Hey everyone, I'm your People Behind the Science host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and I appreciate you joining us today for episode 626. We are excited to be rebroadcasting our interview with Dr. Michael Archer, originally published on September 2nd of 2015. Listeners, Michael is a renowned paleontologist specializing in ancient Australian vertebrates. He and his research team have discovered fossils from dozens of never-before-seen mammals, and their work likely contributed to an area called Riversleigh in Queensland, Australia, becoming a World Heritage Site. Michael's research efforts have also focused on conservation through sustainable use of native resources, using information from the fossil record to secure our futures, and trying to bring back extinct species, including the Tasmanian tiger, which went extinct in 1936. In our conversation, Mike shared more about his adventures throughout his life and research. So listeners, get ready to hear more in this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am thrilled to be here today with Dr. Michael Archer. So, Mike, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm fine, Marie. Thank you.
Well, we are excited to have you with us today, Mike, and I'm excited to introduce you to our listeners. So I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background about you. Listeners, Mike is a professor of paleobiology in the School of Biological, Earth, and Environmental Sciences at the University of New South Wales in Australia. He received his undergraduate education from Princeton University in Geology and Biology. He was then awarded a Fulbright Scholarship to study in Australia, and he remained there to earn his PhD in Zoology from the University of Western Australia. Mike has since worked at the Western Australian, Queensland, and Australian museums and joined the faculty at the University of New South Wales in 1978. He has received many awards and honors, listeners, including being named one of the top 100 most influential people in Sydney in 2008, receipt of the Riversleigh Society Medal, the TH Huxley Award from the Australian Museum, and the Australian Centennial Medal from the Federal Government of Australia. He's also a member of the Australian Institute of Biology, as well as a fellow of the Royal Zoological Society of New South Wales, the World Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Australian College of Educators, the Australian Academy of Science, the Royal Society of New South Wales, and Australia 21. And Mike is here with us today, listeners, to tell us about his experiences in life and science. So, Mike, today we want to get to know you, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do with your time when you're not busy doing science?
I have to say, those are pretty rare gaps between when I do science. How does anybody conduct their life without doing science 24/7? I mean, we all do it.
This is a good question.
I must say, I do stretch it a little bit, though, and I dabble into the extension of science, which is sometimes called science fiction. And there is no science fiction movie I have not devoured at least 20 times. Because 85% of what was science fiction 20 years ago has lost the fiction bit and is now science. So in some ways, this is my magic ball of prediction about what's going to happen. It's pretty much what's rolled out in those movies. I love them.
I like it. So what is your favorite science fiction movie if you had to pick just one?
It would be ridiculous of me not to admit that Jurassic Park, for all its faults, was one of my favorites. And I must say, it's interesting, Michael Crichton wrote that book. He was actually a medical doctor, and he wrote the book, as he says in the introduction, deliberately to scare the living daylights out of kids and everybody into never trying something like this. And what a failure. I mean, he probably excited more people about the idea of bringing extinct animals back than everyone else combined. Anyway, it's a fantastic movie, and I've loved all the sequels. But the weirder and the stranger, I loved Alien, anything that explores different outcomes of how life might have evolved in other areas, other planets, other parts of the universe. I love this because this stretches my mind. It's the same reason paleontology fascinates me. It takes me out of the modern world and shows me all the wonderful things that the Earth has produced in the past. Well, science fiction just sort of extends that with a bit of imagination, asking questions, what would life be like on Venus and so on. Anyway, it's a lot of fun.
Definitely. I think I'm a science fiction fan myself, so I think it's just a good way to escape, to, like you said, stretch your mind, think about the possibilities in the future. And I know Jurassic Park as a kid was terrifying to me, so he succeeded at least in convincing me. But let's talk about your science next, Mike. Can you tell us how you describe what you do to someone who's not familiar with your field?
It is funny, because when I was a kid, I really didn't get on with people all that well. I grew up in Appalachia, and I have to say, deep intellectual conversations in the heart of Appalachia was a pretty rare thing to find. Wonderful people and everything, but I found more synergies communicating with turtles and snakes and trees. So as a kid, I got pretty hooked on the living world. And it was only a serendipitous accident that introduced me to a boulder that some kind glacier had dropped off in our backyard, probably salvaged from Canada somewhere. And that was my introduction to the fossil world, extinct creatures. There were bridges backwards and forwards from the modern world into the prehistoric world. And it was understanding those links, understanding the relationship of those strange creatures in that boulder to what I found in my backyard that became a kind of a life challenge, just to understand the continuity of life over 3.5 billion years on this planet.
Well, it is a lot to wrap your mind around. I think particularly as a kid, getting excited about science and kind of seeing the evidence right in front of you is so cool. So then can you tell us a little bit about what motivates you? And do you have a particular favorite motivational quote or saying that you like to keep with you as you go through your day?
There are so many. Our own sort of adopted motto here is that we're studying the past in order to understand the present, in order that we can use both to better secure the future for ourselves and for our kids and for the rest of the planet. So it's learning from the past to understand the present to better secure the future. But I guess if I had to sort of cite any single person who inspired me with something they said off the bat, it would probably be Professor John Shine. He's the director of the Garvan Medical Institute. He's a geneticist. And in fact, he's the guy who invented human growth hormone and a whole range of things. He's brilliant. And he became a hero for everybody because he didn't accept what people said couldn't be done. And this man's wisdom has influenced me for a long time. When we started exploring questions about whether some of these marvelous extinct animals we were studying actually might be able to be brought back to life, his genetics colleagues ridiculed this. They said this was ridiculous. Go back to your paleontology and play with your bones.
Right. Go back to your science fiction. Yeah.
And he said, as a geneticist, he turned around publicly to these critics and said, hey, guys, just take a deep breath here and think back 20 years about what was then impossible, what was never going to happen, like cloning and so on, and then realize most of that stuff that was impossible is already happening. And now cast your minds forward 20 years, and who's brave enough to tell us what can't happen 20 years into the future? And most of those critical geneticists just shut up, went back into their corners, and we rolled on.
Well, that is fantastic. This is a great story and a great example of someone who's really inspired you, someone who didn't take no for an answer and wouldn't let people stop them from really securing their vision and pursuing it. So fantastic example in science. Now, I'm curious, you mentioned John Shine as one of these people who's inspired you. Do you have other role models or people that you can point to who really had a big impact on you and your career?
Oh, absolutely. People that I've read and actually got to know personally. Stephen Jay Gould had a big influence on me. A brilliant man, not only who did really solid science, just like people like Darwin, but was an absolutely astoundingly effective communicator. He could make the most complex ideas simple for a 10-year-old. And that was an important thing to learn. I must say, when I started writing lectures for first-year biology students, the first thing I grabbed was every one of Stephen Jay Gould's essays. The ones that were the most brilliant and the most influential on me, I rolled over and turned them into lectures to inspire first-year university students to get excited about science. So he's a fantastic guy. A little further along, David Wright, who was my PhD supervisor, he's now passed on. David was a wonderfully brilliant, eclectic man. He was interested in paleontology, zoology, evolution, wrote many influential papers, and became, and that was important to me as a role model, director of the Western Australian Museum. And he balanced this leadership role with doing science. And I have to say, it kind of makes me smile as I look back in retrospect. Essentially, he set a pattern for me, because that's what I started to do. Solid foundations of science, then took on some directorships in museums and deanships and so on. But always along the way maintain the research at the same time. So these role models set spectacular good examples for me. And then I'd even single out another guy, Athol Douglas. He has no doctorate, he has no letters after his name. But when I got to Western Australia, and that was 1967, he took me under his wing. He was a bushman. He was a zoologically minded bushman. And he had found many new species, all kinds of weird marsupials and rodents and bats and insects. And his tutorage in the bush for me was mind-blowing. I mean, I thought I understood the wild world. But Athol taught me how to look at the bush in a different way. He said, you look at that tree, and I look at the tree, and he say, all those leaves look the same? And I say, yes.
Yeah.
He said, what about that one? It's tipped down. There's something different about that leaf. Go have a look at it. And I go to that leaf, turn it over, and there's a strange bug distorting the leaf and making an egg sac under it. So Athol taught me how to use my eyes in making discoveries that otherwise I think I would have missed. I actually named a new marsupial after him, Smithopsis douglasii, and he was very delighted about that. But he is also one of my heroes.
Well, that is a fantastic story as well. And as I understand it, you have named quite a few species in your day. So can you tell us a little bit about the experience? How do you choose the names for each of these?
I started out being fairly conventional in the way I did this, naming it after famous people or the discoverer of those species. Or, and I love doing that, if it was a member of the public who made some discovery and weren't sure whether we were going to be excited about it as scientists, I just loved being able to name the thing after them, giving them genuine immortality. Their names were going to last forever as long as there was science. I also used to find sometimes being a little bit mischievous with names was fun. One of the things we did in trying to raise research monies while we were doing our paleontology was to offer to immortalize directors of companies or whatever if they wanted to help the research and give us a bit of a donation. But I also said to them, if you actually have a rival who you really want to kick in the rear end, well, we have some pretty ugly bugs in this fossil record. You could name one of those after them.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, the funding rolled in. And then we started using strange names, like we found a kangaroo, a fossil kangaroo with giant canines like a wolf, and we named it Fangaroo. We started naming other things like Thingodonta and Weirdodonta because these were such strange animals that giving them ordinary names would have been an insult to them.
Right. I want to see this Fangaroo.
Yeah. There's a long-growing legacy now of strange names. We found a giant weird snake that got called Monty Pythonoides and so on. It was a lot of fun.
Certainly. Well, this sounds like one of the really fun aspects of the career then of a paleontologist, being able to come up with the fun, creative names for all these different species that you're discovering. But I want to talk a little bit more about your journey, Mike, and hear about how you got to where you are today. And we mentioned that as a kid, you were very curious about the natural world and starting to get interested in rocks, fossils, those sorts of things. Can you tell us then what took you from this curious kid now to where you are today, a distinguished professor?
I think if I'd been a more successful kid, like a normal kid, and wanted to play football and baseball with my colleagues, I would have had a very different life. But turning my back on that, that was the natural world that opened up to me. And certainly the living world, I actually was convinced I could communicate to turtles and snakes and things when I was a little kid. By the time I was 11 years old, my aunt brought me a little set of minerals in a box. And I was mind blown. They were so beautiful, so fascinating. That introduced me to geology, and off I went. I wanted to understand how animals worked, and I guess it's not a dark side, it was just an intensely curious side. I ordered from Turtok's Biological Supply House when I was about 12, a pickled cat. Mm-hmm. And I spent days and days in the porch at the back of the house. I wasn't allowed to do this in the house. Slowly dissecting this cat and making an anatomical drawings of all the muscles taught me a huge amount and also got me out of picking up dead crows and doing the same thing with those. My mother wasn't real happy about that.
Sure.
So at any rate, it was that blend of the biological world and the geological world that started to happen. When that boulder introduced itself to me, I had a sledgehammer. Every weekend, I and several other kids who were infected with my enthusiasm would spend our weekends with chisels and sledgehammers slowly taking this boulder apart. And it had trilobites in it and brachiopods and all sorts of weird stuff. But I didn't know what these were, and there was no way in Pine Plains, New York, where I was ever going to be able to find out. So my father was understanding, and he actually let me get on the steam train and go down to the American Museum with a suitcase full of these fossils. And I guess I would have been about 12 at that point. And I met a man in the museum, Norman B. Newell. He's kind of got godlike attributes to me. He was one of the people who the American Museum knew was very good with kids. And he invited me to come into his office, opened up the suitcase, and he actually got quite excited because what I had were Chemung Devonian fossils. They're about 370 million years old, and the American Museum didn't have a particularly good collection from that particular time period. So him getting excited, looking at the trilobites that I was finding, really communicated and reinforced in me the excitement of paleontology. And he actually sent me back and said, keep going, see what else you can find.
Right. More suitcases, yeah.
Yeah, so I had lots of trips down, back and forward to the American Museum, and that bonded me to the wonderful smells of old museums. My memory of these things as a kid are precious to me.
Certainly.
Anyway, from then on, strange things happened. I started leading expeditions of some of the junior high school students down to Chesapeake Bay. You can't do that now because it's all private area, private land. But there were Miocene fossil deposits along the west side of Chesapeake Bay, and I'd read about them. And I took this team down there to collect all these shells. We had particular things we were going to try to find. These were all about 20 million years old. And we found dolphin skulls, fossil dolphin skulls. So it was really exciting. It just sort of set a pattern. So every year we would take little trips down to that area. I ended up becoming nature director of Camp New Teeming. It was a Boy Scout camp. I guess I was about 14 at that point. And that was fun. I gave all those nature merit badges because these were all hobbies to me. It was a piece of cake. Mm-hmm. I did have some unfortunate episodes in my role as nature director at that camp. I was very interested in edible wild foods. And at one point, this camp, which had, must have had about 800 kids in it, was invited to an edible wild foods kitchen that I'd set up. And I'd gone through the bush. I'd got a little handbook, and I'd found out you can make sassafras tea, and you can make skunk cabbage vegetables, and so on. And all these kids were nice and gullible. They're all about 11 to 17. And anything I put on the table in front of them, and of course I made this en masse because there were a lot of kids, they all gobbled up. But the hit of the day was definitely the sassafras tea. It has a beautiful pink color and the sweet smell. And I remember some kids kept coming back and back for more and more of this. I had big pots of it all made up. The next morning, there was a rap on the door of the Nature Lodge, and the director of the camp had a very dark look on his face, and he said, Michael, I just want you to know what happened last night. We have had to fumigate most of the camp's tents. Some kids never managed to get out of their sleeping bags.
Oh, no.
What I had read in this lovely book that had led me into this edible wild foods kitchen is sassafras tea is a terrible laxative.
Disaster.
That was the first and last time I held my edible wild foods kitchen. I mean, there was another thing I tried to do. They had a mineral collection that somebody had left in Camp New Teeming, but no labels on it. So I was doing the usual ways in which you test and identify minerals, and one of these includes a flame test. For a lot of minerals, the color of the mineral when you put it into a flame above a Bunsen burner will give you some clue about what the mineral is. And I found this one lump in the collection that looked a bit like silvery cauliflower. I had no idea what it was. No picture in any book I was looking at gave me a clue. And everything was going fine until I subjected it to the flame test. And it turned out it was magnesium. As soon as it hit the flame, vaguely remember this suddenly, it burst into a brightness equivalent to the sun and then exploded. I was knocked off the chair I was sitting in. By the time I came to, there were bits of this all over the walls of the shed, all burning. I had to put the whole lodge out. At any rate, I discovered what magnesium does when you put it under a flame test.
Right.
So, all learning experiences, I must say.
Well, that is an awesome story. It sounds like you've had some mishaps along the way, but generally speaking, this curiosity has led you quite far in life. So I want to hear next, you were a young kid, you were interested in science, interested in the world. What then brought you to paleontology specifically?
Actually, you know what it was? It was Sputnik. You remember that wonderful satellite that Russia put up?
Yeah.
And in the 50s, that scared the life out of America. All of a sudden, they realized Russia might be getting ahead of America in science. And they started this program of science fairs locally that stretched into regional ones and then went into a national science fair. All of a sudden, science was sexy, and those things which I couldn't talk about with other kids in school were coveted by the schools. Every school wanted to win these prizes. So I started doing paleontological projects, and very soon I found myself right up in the National Science Fair in Albuquerque, extremely excited, and took my science teacher from Pine Plains Central High School, who had never been outside of Pine Plains, the town, to Albuquerque. It just blew his mind. And together, we enjoyed wallowing in the fact that everyone else was enjoying wallowing in the science we were producing.
Sure.
Then the United States also had all these wonderful National Science Foundation summer programs, and I just couldn't think of a better way to spend a summer. I certainly wasn't going to lie around on a beach. I was in California, I was in Syracuse, and these were extremely exciting. There was one program that I'm still very puzzled about, and if any listener has any idea about what this was about, please explain it to me. But I know there was a guy in La Jolla. This was where that particular NSF program was being run. It was Jim Moriarty, and I was supposedly going to be signing up for a program in archaeology. I was going to learn all about archaeology. I'm a paleontologist, so I study ancient animals as such, but archaeology, of course, had more of a focus on human history. I rolled up the first day in La Jolla, and Jim unfurls his bag, and out comes a classical work. I can't even mention what this was. It probably wouldn't be allowed in schools today, and just started to read from this classical book to us. And this went on for about 4 or 5 days. And I'm thinking to myself, this is not exactly what I signed up for. I love it, but...
Right.
And I quietly snuck out of the back of the room and went straight to Capistrano Cliffs in L.A., where I knew there was a fossil deposit. And I just spent 2 or 3 wonderful days with a hammer and a screwdriver splitting those shales, and suddenly found a fossil bird. I could see its head, I could see its wings, and this is Miocene stuff, so I was quite old. I went into the L.A. County Museum, and the curator there was Hildegard Howard, and she was a bird specialist, and she nearly needed a change of undies after she saw what I showed her. She was so excited.
Oh, wow.
She said, could we borrow it? That was a euphemism, I guess, for would you like to give it to us? Mm-hmm. The exchange rate was that I got to go on a trip with their cetaceologists, their paleocetaceologists, the people who study fossil whales. And this was exciting to me. We went to Bakersfield, California, and I spent a week digging up whales and dolphins and sea lions. And that, incidentally, I think may have left me with another legacy, because Bakersfield has, I think, San Joaquin Valley fever or something. There's a fungus in the soil, which I may, in fact, have got a little dose of. And we discovered this later in life. But it didn't stop any of us. And I thought this was the most exciting week of my life. And at the end of it, I snuck back into La Jolla, into Jim Moriarty's class, trusting and hoping that I hadn't been missed. All of a sudden, he stopped reading. It was actually Canterbury Tales. I've just got to tell you what it was. It was wonderful.
Gotcha.
He stopped reading it, and he looked up and he said, "This is what it's all about." And he pointed at me, cowering in the seat in the back of the room. Mm-hmm. And he held up the local L.A. rag. I don't know what it was. And it had a picture of me holding up this fossil bird. And he didn't explain it any more than that. Then he just grinned, put the newspaper down, and went on reading Canterbury Tales.
Oh, wow.
I have no idea what this whole summer program was about, but I'd be fascinated in retrospect to find out. At any rate, I loved it. It was fun.
Well, it sounds like you have a good eye for fossils, and you had a good eye even back then as a kid, finding this bird specimen and bringing it in and really setting this whole chain of events into action. So very, very cool story. And now I'm curious to hear a little bit more, Mike, about what you're working on today. Can you tell us about one of these projects that you have going on right now that you are just so excited about?
Of course, there's a lot. I've been going to the World Heritage fossil deposits in Riversleigh in northwest Queensland now for 39 years without fail. And it's produced hundreds of thousands of beautiful fossils spanning the last 26 million years of extraordinarily unique Australian prehistory. We've really filled in a huge amount of the dark age, of the things we didn't understand about how koalas became koalas, even craziest things like parrots got going, musky rat, kangaroos, snakes. Everything that's in Australia, and many of these things, including some of the bats, for example, have histories that extend out to the rest of the world. So we have colleagues, there's about 100 colleagues working with us in 26 institutions in about 9 countries, all collaborating to work on this material. So that goes on all the time. But at the same time, I certainly do a lot of work with living animals. I'm constantly involved in trying to figure out how to conserve endangered living animals. I'm an advocate for keeping native animals as pets. I'm so annoyed that all we can do in Australia legally, more or less, is keep introduced alien carnivorous pests like dogs and cats. I mean, I love dogs, I have to say.
Sure.
But cats give us such horrendous diseases. They eat the fauna. There are about 20 million feral cats in Australia.
Oh, wow.
The last calculation I did meant that they were eating about 11 trillion native animals a night, turning them into cat poo every single day. This can't go on. And yet we are so reluctant to allow Australians to keep their own animals, Australian animals, and value them as domestic companions. We have to keep these introduced things. So I've been an advocate trying to convince people to share the experiences that I've had all through my life since I've been in Australia. Since 1967, I've had house filled with native animals, quolls, wallabies, possums, and they're all absolutely wonderful. In the U.S., you will be thoroughly familiar with sugar gliders, for example.
Yeah.
I had one student researching the experience of people keeping sugar gliders in the United States, and he spoke to one breeder there who was selling 20,000 of them every year. And yet here, if you try to keep them, you get chucked in jail. There's some crazy iniquities here that I try to turn around. And why? Because one of the fascinating animals to me that has intrigued me all my life is the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, if you like. Mm-hmm. This animal went extinct in 1936. The last one died in a zoo in Tasmania. It was a terrible, terrible tragedy. What's interesting is that when you go back over the records of people interacting with this animal, many people were actually keeping them as pets, but it was illegal. So they had to kill them. They had to turn them in. If that had not been illegal, if people had been allowed to keep those native animals as pets, the question is, would they be extinct today? And of course, the answer is no. So I'm trying to extend that wisdom generally to convince management agencies and fauna regulatory bodies to allow more Australians to keep native animals as pets as a way of extra ensuring that they don't go extinct into the future. I also use our fossil record to provide very innovative ways to conserve endangered species. We have a precious animal called the mountain pygmy possum. It's the cutest thing. If you see one of these things, you just want to hug it to death. It's so sweet. Big eyes, furry little face.
Aw.
It's so cute. It lives in the alpine zone of Australia, and there's not much of the alpine zone in this continent. But this possum depends on snowfall to insulate it while it hibernates in the rock piles over winter. 1 degree rise in temperature with climate change is going to eliminate the snowfields from Australia. When that happens, cold, icy air will go down in the rock piles, and these possums are going to die. Now, ecologists have said, well, this is a tragedy, but it's going to be one of the early casualties of climate change. We've been saying, as paleontologists, no, there is another alternative. We've traced this very precious animal's lineage over the last 26 million years. And through its whole history, it's always been living in cool, temperate, lowland rainforest, not up in alpine zones.
Interesting.
We think it followed the rainforest up the mountain in one interglacial and got stuck there. And our argument is, for goodness sake, let's get a trial population before it goes extinct and start to acclimatize it to put it back in its favorite preferred habitat that it's been in for the last 24 million years. Finally, I'm being listened to. We now have about $120,000. We're seeking more support to build a breeding facility in the lowlands. Everything is going to go now. We've got green lights everywhere to do exactly that, because I'm absolutely convinced, and will wager the left portion of any of my anatomy, that will be the happiest lot of possums in the world if they suddenly find themselves back in the habitat that they've always been accustomed to. So we use the paleontology to try to help save endangered species. But we also, of course, started in 1990 questioning whether or not we could bring back extinct animals. And this has been a side project that's been going on for a long time. I started with the thylacine. We did end up getting the DNA of the animal out of pickled specimens and out of the teeth of museum specimens.
Wow.
But I started, in particular, the Lazarus Project in the last few years, which is an extinct Australian frog. Now, this frog actually only went extinct about 40 years ago. But it is globally the most extraordinary frog that has ever evolved. This frog, when they laid their eggs and they were fertilized, as frogs normally do, the female turned around and swallowed the fertilized eggs. And she turned her stomach into a uterus so that in her stomach, these eggs hatched into tadpoles. And then the tadpoles metamorphosed in her stomach into little frogs. And then she had a big projectile vomit and sprayed out all these little baby frogs. When the medical world saw this, that flipped their lid. They thought, how has an animal here converted its stomach into a proxy uterus? And what could we learn from that? And just as everybody got excited about it, it went extinct. Bang. So I contacted the colleague that I had who'd last had one of these in a laboratory in the University of Adelaide and asked him by any chance, had he frozen any tissues? To make a long story short, he tore his freezer apart in the University of Adelaide, and he did find a jar way in the bottom with frozen tissues, not cryoprotected. Mm-hmm. So we thought they might be damaged tissues, but it turned out they seemed pretty good. And for the last few years, we've been extracting the nuclei from the cells of this frozen tissue and injecting them into the eggs of a living Australian frog. And we're actually getting embryos. So we've actually brought the DNA back. It's been reproducing. It's building early stage embryos of this frog. We still have lots of speed bumps to overcome, but we're not giving up. And we'll try to figure out why can't we get it to go from those early stages to keep going into a tadpole. That's what we're working on now.
Well, this is so cool, Mike. I think you have so many exciting projects going on in your lab right now. And I think in talking about them, you hinted at some of the challenges that you're facing with your current research. And we love talking about challenges on our program to give people an idea of what scientists are up against sometimes. And for future scientists out there, what you may have to face in your own career. So, Mike, can you think back on your career and share with us one of your trying times and how you got through it?
There was one. It was an odd one, but it was connected with my paleontology, with my fossil work. You know, every year we work at Riversleigh, we have to haul sacks of limestone, which contain these precious fossils, often over kilometers of uneven ground, to get them to a place where we can put them in a vehicle and move them south to Sydney.
Sure.
Having done this for so many years, tons and tons on my back, eventually it starts to take its toll on your back. Your body wasn't designed to do this. And I started to get a really bad back. I went into a doctor and I said, what's wrong? And he said, nothing's wrong except your back's 10 years older than the rest of you. And we're probably going to have to fuse up the lower part of your back, something called a laminectomy. When he described to me that I was going to have to lie on my back for several weeks and do my business in a pan, I thought, there's no way this is going to happen.
Right.
I went back in the field, and they did help me along. They actually put a plaster shell on me. I looked like a mutant ninja turtle here because I had this big plaster jacket that was supposed to immobilize my back while it attempted to heal itself.
That is awesome.
And I was up in Cairns, which is one of the tropical love spots for tourists who visit Australia. And I was giving a lecture up there, and I was in my turtle shell. And I'd had a long history, I should add, too, of problems with another introduced animal in Australia. This is the cane toad. It was introduced in the 30s to try to deal with a pest that was chewing the farmers' cane fields. It didn't work, and the toad went feral, and it's been a huge problem. It killed my pet quoll, so I'm not happy about cane toads at all. At any rate, when I was in Cairns in my turtle shell, I was in a hotel, and walking out behind my little room, there was a place where people were eating dinner out on a deck. And I was so blindly focused on my dislike of cane toads, and if I saw them, I would always jump on them. You know, every cane toad down meant one less native animal that wasn't going to be poisoned. And I saw this one hopping and didn't actually stop to realize I had climbed up on the pavilion where everybody was eating their dinner in my weird turtle shell and started leaping on the floor, jumping on the cane toads that were hopping around the table.
Oh, my goodness.
And heard these knives and forks sort of clatter down to the table as everybody looked at this and thought,
awkward silence ensues. Yeah.
Which science fiction movie did this thing just climb out of? When I realized what had happened, I didn't even try to explain. It was not going to work.
Right, just slowly back away.
Waddled back in my shell back to my room. Right. Eventually, my back did heal, so it was worth it.
Good, good. Well, this sounds like a struggle that you might not encounter in every research field. So this is very particular to the struggle in paleontology. I like it. So, Mike, we don't just want to talk about the tough times. Can you tell us next about one of your success stories? I know you have many to choose from, but choose one that meant a lot to you, whether it's a big victory or just a small win along the way.
There was an epiphany I had while we were working. It was Riversleigh again. I mean, after all, I can't work there 39 years without having a few golden moments occur along the way. Mm-hmm. It was 1983, and it was the culmination of a realization that the fossil deposits at Riversleigh might be far bigger and more extraordinary than we ever imagined. Actually, it started out by using explosives to try to crack the limestone. One of the team that I was with was so frightened by that first unfortunate experience using explosives. I'm surprised Neil Armstrong didn't find some of that stuff on the moon. It really went.
Put your magnesium early in memory to shame right there.
Yeah, I will have to explain when they come back to this weird bit of fossil marsupial from the moon next time.
Right.
But anyway, this one guy who was with us sort of thought, no way, and he took off up the hill to hide before we tried a second experiment, and found he's sitting on a rock with lots of tiny bones. They had bat bones in it, and that was the beginning of discovering how important Riversleigh's bat fossils were. But it was in a slightly tawny-colored limestone, and it was the first time we'd seen little animals from these fossil deposits. So we were excited. And I mentioned this to a colleague in Canberra who had lots of money, and he had color air photos of the whole area. And he said, hey, guess what, guys? Way beyond where anybody thought there were appropriate fossils, the same tawny color shows up on his air photos. So in '83, we walked into that area to see if by any chance there was much more of these fossil deposits than we thought. I got out of the car and went up over the hill. The geologists we were with, as typical of geologists, they take 3-yard strides in one big leap. They walked over about 40 fossil deposits on their way up the hill.
Sure.
I waited at the edge of the hill. Sue Hand, who was starting to study bats at that point, was gathering the maps from the car just below the edge of the plateau. And I waited so she could see where we were. And I looked down at my feet on the rock I was standing on, and there's spinifex. This is prickly grass that grows around Australia. And under the spinifex were all these little rolly rocks. And the one I was standing on nearly caused me to have a heart attack. There were jaws and skulls sticking out of little tiny animals, bandicoots, quolls, ancestral Tasmanian tigers. Out of one rock about the size of a human head, when we dissolved this with acetic acid, there were 34 different kinds of new mammals that we had never seen before.
Wow.
And I was so excited. I guess Sue just saw me disappear into the spinifex as I dropped to my knees. I'm told I was making growling noises as I was crawling around in the grass, realizing every part of the ground I was standing on was riddled with millions of fossils. We called all the geologists back, and that was the beginning of one of the most extraordinary days of my life. That led ultimately to it becoming a World Heritage Fossil Deposit. So yeah, there were some very exciting moments I love to look back on.
Well, that is an amazing story. So I must say, paleontology is fascinating for myself, and I'm sure a lot of other listeners out there also have this love of dinosaurs, a love of the ancient world, and want to know more about it. But within that field of paleontology, I mean, how much of it is luck, and how much of it is just being able to do specific science, looking at geology, triangulating everything, and finding the right place, quote unquote, with the most fossils?
Probably the vast bulk of it is luck. I mean, we'd love to say we were so smart and that we study the geology and we predict where we're going to find our fossils. If only that were true. I probably spend 90% of my time when searching for fossils not finding them. And in fact, what we rely on, as much as anything else, is the good luck of everybody else. Most of the most important fossil deposits that have been found in Australia, and for that matter, I suspect most of the rest of the world, have been found by amateurs, not professional paleontologists. Many of them don't realize how important it is what they've found. One of the loveliest people I've ever met was a guy by the name of Jim Barrett up in Townsville. He loved to do fishing, and every weekend he would explore all the rivers all up around North Queensland, walking along the edges fishing. He finally sent a letter. I was in the Queensland Museum at that point, and he said, I wonder if you guys might be interested in outdrop all these photos of jaws and teeth and bones, and he apologized for bothering me. He said, I'm really sorry. I haven't found any completely articulated skeletons, so I don't think you're going to be interested in this.
Right.
2 days later, I was up in his backyard, and he found one of the most important fossil deposits in northeast Queensland. It turned out to be 3.8 million years old and filled a huge gap in our understanding about the evolution of Australia's animals. Most of the fossil deposits that I'm working in actually were originally found by amateurs. You tend to think of paleontologists as having to get into Jeeps and Land Rovers and going out into remote areas to find things.
Mm-hmm.
Every now and then, that's not true. And there was a guy in a town called Murgon. This is Mr. Porter. Oh, I love that man. Mr. Porter had been plowing his field right behind his house, only about 50 yards from his back door, and kept churning up these giant pieces of turtle shell and crocodiles. And he finally sent some of those into the Queensland Museum. We visited him, and he showed us in the backyard, and long story, but eventually we worked out this stuff was 55 million years old. It was before the time when Australia separated from Antarctica. It was a time when, in fact, you could have walked from Australia all the way up to Canada. It was a magic moment of exchanging animals back and forth across the continents. We started to work in his backyard. We dug a little pit right in his cow paddock just beyond his field and started finding wonderful treasures. Even the oldest songbirds in the world by 20 million years turned up in this pit. He got very excited. He was a fairly elderly gentleman. His wife was really sweet. And he would come down with his cane to the edge of the pit and he'd say, "What have you found?" And we'd show him a crocodile skull that we just dug up. And he'd go, "Oh," and fall over backwards. And he had to turn. And his wife would come running down with a cup of tea and get him back on his feet.
Fan him, yeah.
This happened 2 years in a row. And from the third year we turned up, she said, "Jim's not actually going to be allowed to come down and see you while you're in your pit," because she didn't know
can't handle it.
By the third year. Wonderful man. And just as interesting to us in that situation, we just drove up on the tar, just drove off the edge by the front of his house and grabbed our shovels and picks and awls and just walked into his backyard. So some of these most extraordinary discoveries made by amateurs are right in their own backyards.
Well, that is phenomenal. Listeners, take note here. The skeletons do not need to be fully articulated to be of interest to the paleontologist if you find something interesting out there. Wonderful to hear a little bit more about your profession, about some of the experiences that you've had. And I know we chatted a little bit about your life outside of science in the beginning of the interview. And one thing that I do love to chat with all of our guests about is what they're reading. And this doesn't have to be a science book. You can recommend either science or non-science. We'll take either. But can you tell us about a book that you've read and really enjoyed, Mike?
There have been many, of course. Now, if you could see behind me, you'd see that there are 2 whole walls of my study that are lined with DVDs. So I have to say, and admit with a feeling of shame here, that DVDs are eroding into my book reading, I'm afraid. But books changed my life. And so one of them is the reason I'm here in Australia, having expected to return back to the United States in 1967. I had, as a kid, read Henry Hudson's Green Mansions. I don't know if you know this book, but
I don't.
My father was a writer. He wrote about 80 books, mostly nonfiction for teenagers. He loved to describe himself as a gadfly in American society. Any political figure around the world that was being demonized in the U.S., he would try to find the human side of them. So my father's writing experience was enormous, and books were critical to him. But Henry Hudson's story about the rainforest in South America and this very strange group of people, the Eli, I think, there was the daughter of the Didi. For a teenager who fantasized about beautiful women and everything, he had everything. Mm-hmm. And the rainforest, though, was the magic bit that these strange people lived in the rainforest, were interacting with some savage Europeans who didn't understand the beauty of the natural world. When I came to Queensland for the first time, and I went into that rainforest in northeast Queensland around Cairns, that book just sort of dropped on me like a ton, because here, and the title of the book says it all, Green Mansions. Here was the real thing that Henry Hudson described in his book, this beautiful world where everything that was colossal and gargantuan and awe-inspiring and breathtaking was the natural world. There was these giant trees, little possums and tree kangaroos cavorting and little wallabies around your feet. That book hooked my childhood up to my then adulthood and resulted in me sending a letter to my father saying, "It's been fun, Dad. Right. I'm not coming back."
This is home now. I like it.
Yeah. The second book that more recently I've been recommending to everybody is Neil Shubin's Your Inner Fish. It's a wonderful book. If you have ever wondered about that annoying little eustachian canal that hooks your throat to your middle ear that sometimes gets infected, and you want to understand, what is our body about? What is the ground plan? How did we get this strange-looking body with all the various structures that we've got? Neil Shubin's book, Your Inner Fish, actually takes you from a fish all the way through to humans, explaining what part of us has its origin in earlier vertebrates that used to be swimming around in the water. I now understand my eustachian canal actually is a gill slit. It's a remnant gill slit. You remember that movie Waterworld?
I do. It was a terrible movie.
It was one of his best. I'm not sure what that's saying, but right. There was a wonderful thing in there where he actually had a little mutation that caused him to develop a gill behind his ear. Well, actually, that's possible. That eustachian canal could develop gill tissue and just might be able to enable us to oxygen exchange while swimming underwater. Hey, that was the best point of that movie.
This is true. This is true. Fantastic recommendations, Mike. We will add these to our list for our listeners to find when they are in search of their next great read. And I know we've talked a little bit throughout our conversation about the places you've been for science, and I think you get to go so many fantastic places, particularly as a paleontologist. So can you tell us about one of your favorite places you've been to?
Patagonia is right up there at the top of my list. That was an interesting coincidence that we ended up in Patagonia, and that's the southern part of Argentina. And the reason we were there was a friend of mine, Rosendo Pascual. He's now passed away. He used to be in the University de La Plata, a professor, and he had taken a team down to look at a fossil deposit in Patagonia that was 63 million years old. And one of his students got tired of crawling around on their hands and knees to find fossils because they were hurting his knees and hands. And he dropped onto his rear end, and something jabbed him in his rear end as he landed on the ground. He reached around, picked it up, and it was a tooth. It was a very strange tooth. And between Rosendo and Francisco and all the people who were there, none of them had seen a tooth like this. And Rosendo was a good friend of mine. In fact, he'd been over to Riversleigh on a visit once with us. And he sent me a not particularly good photograph of this tooth. And I was shocked when I got this photo because we had been studying teeth of a fossil platypus from Australia. Modern platypuses don't have teeth. They gum their food to death. They bruise it. Mm-hmm. But these ancestral platypuses that we're finding at about 18 million years old had teeth. And Rosendo's photo looked terrifyingly similar to what we were finding in Australia. This, to us, was a shock. It's a bit like George Bush wandering in his backyard and saying he's found a fossil koala in Texas. Well, there's some things that should never be allowed to happen.
Right.
Somebody saying they found a platypus in South America was one of those kind of things. Platypus were Australian. They belonged to us. We were unraveling their story. How dare they find a platypus in South America? Mm-hmm. But, of course, the lands were connected. At any rate, we did get Rosendo over, and he brought his tooth with him. I didn't even remember saying, hey, Rosendo, mi amigo. I said, where's your tooth? And he was ready for that. He brought out his tooth, and we compared it with the things we were getting from Riversleigh. And they could have been different species in the same genus. They were so similar. And he saw all of our students and colleagues excited, but also kind of crestfallen. All of a sudden, platypuses were not just Australian. They belonged to the rest of the world.
Not as special as you thought, yeah.
Yeah, well, he was really a nice guy. And he said, look, why don't we have a joint expedition? We'll see if there's more. After all, they only had one tooth. And that was the beginning of it. It was 1992. We went over to Argentina. I had a team sponsored by Dick Smith and Australian Geographic here. And we worked with the Argentinian team, and that was so exciting. That was so wonderful. We did find more of that platypus. We even found lots of interesting things. We found the Australian lungfish in those fossil deposits, and even a frog that belonged to a uniquely Australian group of frogs. But this one in Argentina was about a yard long, not its legs, its body. So there were a whole lot of reasons why, to us as Australians, Patagonia was suddenly looking very, very like home. And it's just a reminder of how those lands were linked. But the desert was beautiful. And I think the only downside I can remember on that whole trip was we were invited to share all the meals the Argentinians were cooking. And I'm a mammologist as well as a paleontologist. I usually know mammals. But there was a foot sticking out of that pot.
Oh, dear.
When we arrived, and I did not actually recognize what mammal that was. But over the next month, it subsided in there with sand and more chili and everything else. And the description of this meal was something volcanic. I couldn't quite interpret it. But after 4 days, I woke up middle of the night still holding down the tent. The wind down there is unbelievable. That is the land where I think the expression was invented, never piss into the wind. Because there's no way you can relieve yourself and not have a shower. There's just no way you can do it. Mm-hmm. So the wind is extraordinary. At any rate, I woke up at about 4 a.m, no trees in Patagonia, no privacy, and my gut was heaving, and I knew something was going to happen. I was either pregnant or something else more unpleasant was going to happen. Right. Desperately looking for a tree, and they're all about 2 inches high. So you had to swallow your pride over a lot of this, but just getting used to that country was magic. I love Patagonia. It's just a wonderful experience.
Well, it sounds like a beautiful and wonderful place to be. And it sounds like you've been able to travel to a lot of exciting places. And I think in addition, though, to these places you get to go, I think the people you get to work with are a big part of what makes science wonderful. And we've talked a little bit about some of these people who you've worked with over the years, but I love focusing on the human side of science and sharing just some of these fun traditions that you get and just some of the funny memories that you shared with people. So do you have a story that really highlights that human side that you could share with us today?
Lots of them. Practical jokes are part of this profession. If you don't have a sense of humor, you're in the wrong game.
Yeah.
I first discovered that in Princeton University when I was an undergraduate student. Again, I really worked mostly with the graduate students in the paleo lab. And so early, I was given a fossil to work on in the bench in the paleontological laboratory. And there were two wonderful people who worked in that lab. One of them was Bob Rainey, who's now passed on. He was in the University of Texas. And the other is Charlie Schaff, who's still around. He's worked in Yale, Harvard. And all of us were used to playing little weird jokes. Well, I got caught. The first one I got caught on was I was sitting down at my bench. And this was a long bench. I was the only one on the bench. Bob was on one side of the room working away on, he was working on one of the first and oldest bats found in Australia. Our Professor Glenn Jepson, had just worked on this for about 30 years. Charlie was working on a mammal at the other end of the lab, and they're all busy ticking away with their needles, and we're in idle little chat. And I'm sitting down, starting to work on my octocyanid, and we're having conversations. And all of a sudden, I felt my crotch warm and wet. And this is a very frightening thing.
Right.
If you haven't done this yourself, you don't want that to happen. And I looked down, and sure enough, I was wet, and I hadn't done anything. And I thought, oh, my God, I'm losing control.
Right. Awkward moment. Yeah.
My conversation drifted into meaningless gobbledygook as I was trying to think what had happened. And all of a sudden, I felt the feeling again. And I looked down, and it was spreading. And I'm thinking, oh, God, I am definitely dying here. I stopped talking, and they kept yammering on. And then there was this massive feeling of warmth and wet. And I look down, and I see squirt, squirt, squirt coming into my lap. And I lean under the table, and here's a hose that has been stapled all the way along the bench, all the way to the other end of the lab. And there's Bob Rainey with a bulb of warm water going squirt, squirt.
Keeping the casual conversation going the whole time, right?
There was a lot of revenge over that one, I can tell you.
Well, that is hilarious. I like this whole theme of practical jokes going through the lab and the research. So were you ever the initiator of one of these practical jokes, or do you have one that was your own design that you could share?
Oh, yeah, I did share some with a bunch of students. And it was back here in Australia. We had one guy who was proficient. He was doing his PhD on fossil crocodiles. And he was very good at crocodile spotting. We do actually work with live crocodiles that are there with us. But in the river alongside which we work, they're only freshwater crocodiles. They don't eat you, but they're pretty awesome-looking guys. They can be like about 3 yards long and pretty hefty crocs. But they eat fish. This paleontologist said he was going to take a canoe out. Did anybody want to come? And they were going to go croc spotting. You use a torch, and you look for little red eye shine. And if you're really quick, you can catch small crocodiles by hand. The girls had told me they'd wired up what they were going to do. They had bought bicycle reflectors, great big red bicycle reflectors. And they put 2 of these in a giant floating log that they'd found upriver in the direction in which these crocodile spotting trips usually go. Mm-hmm. And they'd moored this log alongside the shore. Well, of course, Paul, who was this paleontologist, never expected anything other than freshwater crocodiles. But I was fully expecting, as I offered to be the rower of his canoe as we went up the river with several other canoes behind us, I expected him to only be anticipating freshwater crocodiles. And we paddled up right past where they told me this thing was moored, and he didn't spot it with his flashlight. And I thought, oh, it's sunk. Mm-hmm. At any rate, we're coming back down the river, a bit of a disappointment, and all of a sudden, Paul says, hang on, I've got something. And he turned around and spotted these red eye shines. And I turned around, quite excited, and got the canoe around and started paddling towards this thing. I was probably about 50 yards away, and Paul says, hang on, don't go any closer. I said, why? And he said, that's no freshwater crocodile. Uh-huh. And I said, Paul, you know there's only freshwater crocodiles in this river. Uh-huh. No. And so I just paddled harder, right straight at this thing. And Paul started to shout and scream, "No, stop, you mad bugger." He said, don't. And when we got about 5 yards away from it, I rolled the canoe over.
Oh, my gosh.
To the river.
He's crying at this point. Yeah.
The people who were waiting on the shore with cameras and everything else, when they went off, they said his legs and arms were going like pistons so much that 3/4 of his body was out of the water before he got out of the river. And I was nearly drowning. I was laughing so hard, hanging onto this upturned canoe. When I got to the shore, struggling, he was there with a one-finger salute. But anyway, he got me back with some subsequent tricks. So, yeah, practical jokes are a normal part of what happens in these field trips.
Well, that is a fantastic prank and well executed, Mike, I must say. Well, great to hear a little bit about the human side of science, some of these fun stories from your experiences out in the field. And I know we've chatted a little bit about your research, the work that you've done over the course of your career, but I want to talk next about one of these questions you have not yet been able to answer. So, Mike, if we gave you everything, if funding, staff, technology, feasibility, nothing was a barrier, what would you want to answer?
There are two things I guess I would really like to say straight away. One is I would love to get back to trying to get the thylacine back into the world again. This is just a lot of hard work. And along the way, we would learn all sorts of technologies that would help save endangered living species as well. So a lot of merit in trying to do that. It could use a bit of funding. But I say, if you really say you're taking the lid off what's available, how about we melt down East Antarctica? Hey, if we wait for climate change, maybe it'll happen anyway. Mm-hmm. But I would love to know what is in the fossil deposits under those 2 kilometers of ice in East Antarctica. That was the link between Australia and the rest of the world, and we know absolutely nothing about it. Some fossil deposits have poked up in the West Antarctic Peninsula, and they're just tantalizing us as to what else must be waiting under the ice. It's the only continent about which we know next to nothing about the history of. So if you've got any tame billionaires, right. I've got a few things we could work on here.
Well, listeners out there, if you are a paying billionaire and you are ready to fund a fun project, it sounds like we've got some lined up for you here with Mike. So, and now we've talked about some of the people who've had a big impact on your career. And I think as a scientist, you get a lot of advice from a lot of different people as you're going through the process. Can you pinpoint one piece of advice, Mike, that you would just consider is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
It's hard to go past sometimes things your father said to you or your mother. My father gave me his wisdom that got him through World War II, the horrible times in his life, and it was always just, this too shall pass. And just something as simple as that enabled him to endure difficulties and get to the other side of them. But that wasn't what stuck with me, and it wasn't what really influenced my life. And in fact, in many ways, I think, has driven me down the paths I've traveled. And it was that he said, if most people are convinced that something is true, it's probably wrong. And this has transformed in me into a kind of a perverse discovery or joy of discovering things that people say can't be done or can't happen. There's a part of me that says, I just don't know that I believe that. I will always thank somebody very politely for telling me what it is that we can't do or something that's impossible, and then beg their forgiveness if we just see if we can have a go at it anyway. The worst thing that we as teachers, as mentors, as people who work with younger scientists can do is to try to tell them what we know and what can be known. It's an outrageous thing to me that we still do this. All the stupid things that scientists over the years have said were the limits of something that we could do, only to find 5 years later somebody else went way beyond those limits unexpectedly, and all of a sudden somebody looks like an idiot having made these categorical statements.
Right.
This happened with the thylacine project. We were trying to see if we could recover ancient DNA from the thylacine. And I did make one mistake when we started that project, and I think that was to allow the media to be aware of what we were doing. With the Lazarus Project, we've been much more circumspect about what we were saying publicly. But with the thylacine project, every time we said we were going to see if we could find ancient DNA in a pickled little girl pup that had been pickled in 1866, immediately geneticists came out and said, that's ridiculous. Even if it is alcohol, the DNA will not preserve that long. And one geneticist was saying this in particular in the media and just saying it's all ridiculous. This wasn't about cloning, it was clowning. And they were really ridiculing this. At any rate, we went into it and we found DNA, and it was thylacine DNA. So the next thing was, well, it won't be any good. You won't be able to get it to do PCR. which is polymerase chain
reaction.
Yeah, and then this is basically molecular cloning. And suddenly we did that. And every time we said what we were going to try, they would say, you can't do it. And then when we did it, they'd say, oh, well, why would you expect you couldn't do it? And then they come up with another negative. And finally, one of these guys who kept saying what can't be done and kept discovering that we were doing it anyway didn't go to the papers when we said we'd actually at that point got nuclear and mitochondrial DNA, sequenced it, and identified the particular genes that we had. This time he didn't go to the papers. He rang me up. And all he said was, can I help?
Oh, wow.
It was kind of nice. But it sort of highlighted to me, eventually, everybody has to realize we just should not be focused on what we think can't be done. That's the worst position that we can put ourselves in, and it's the worst thing we can say to any student. For goodness sake, if you can imagine it, try it. And that wisdom goes back to my father.
Well, I think that is a great message. I think you shouldn't try and limit the possibilities of science, the possibilities of what can be achieved in your field by just automatically thinking that it can't be done. So I'm so glad that you shared that story. Mike, is there any other last piece of advice or any last note of inspiration that you would like to end our interview on today?
I just hope that we realize how important it is to listen to what science is telling us. We're all kind of depressed by watching science unfold, all the important understanding about how we're changing the world, the impacts we're having on it. And then you see so many unfortunate people struggling to misinform or confuse the public about what science is trying to say. I just hope the next generation rediscovers the respect for science that was typical perhaps a couple of decades ago, and doesn't listen to the trolls and the nutters who are trying to convince you that cigarettes are good to smoke and that you don't have to worry about burning coal. It's our friend. We need the students today to listen to what science has to tell us about how to have a good future for everybody and every animal on the planet. Please.
Well, very well said, Mike. I like this call to action of thinking logically, appreciating science, and not letting people misconstrue what is actually going on in the world of science. This is one of the reasons why we love bringing scientists on our podcast to talk to them about their experiences and to show the public out there that scientists are people too. They're trying to discover the truth about the world. So thank you so much for being on our program. Can you tell our listeners how they can reach out and learn more about you and your work?
Just give me an email, m.archer, that's A-R-C-H-E-R, at UNSW, stop EDU, stop AU, and I'll be delighted to hear from you.
Perfect. Well, listeners, definitely reach out if you have any questions. And Mike, thank you so much again for being on our program today and sharing so many wonderful stories.
It's a pleasure, Marie.
Well, it was a pleasure to chat with you and a pleasure to have you guys on board, listeners. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.